All right, well, good evening and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the inaugural Bernard William Vann Fellow in Christianity in the Military here at Durham University, as well as the Executive Director of the ICMI, and I'm glad that each of you has joined us tonight. I'll be doing double duty tonight as both the host for the webinar and the speaker, leading a conversation on moral injury in film, TV, and popular culture. As you'll likely know, the International Center for Moral Injury is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for pastoral counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. Each of these things serve the Center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. The webinar tonight is part of our larger monthly webinar program, which seeks to fulfill at least one of those larger aims through building resources for those caring for morally injured individuals. Just as a brief note, if you are interested in our webinars, I would ask that you might subscribe to our YouTube channel itself as well. If you're like me, you might be frustrated by the seemingly constant requests to like and subscribe things on social media. But in this case, we are becoming increasingly aware that more subscribers to the channel where we place videos about our resources helps to raise our profile and allows these resources to be discovered by more people who may benefit from them. So if you are able, this would be wonderful. So as we arrive at the point where I would normally introduce our speaker, I come to the somewhat awkward Austin Powers-ish allow myself to introduce myself moment. So let me just note for anyone joining us for the first time, I'm a former United States Air Force officer. I served for most of my 8 years as a combatant special operations weather team leader. After my time in service, which included deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, I explored and interrogated really my own experiences of violence and conflict during seminary and graduate school. Emerged nearly a decade later with a few ideas about theology and moral injury that I've been fortunate enough to share in my position here at Durham University. And I'm thrilled to be able to discover all the work that so many are doing in moral injury here in the UK and across the world, and to be able to highlight and lift that up and hopefully have conversations together as the executive director here of the ICMI. So as I turn to what I want to present this evening, I'm going to share my screen briefly. As we seek to define moral injury more precisely and perhaps more saliently, when introducing the term to others, I'm often either pressed to name a good example in some shared narrative that we have, or compelled to feel that it might help me to do so in different conversations. The stories we tell, after all, within our cultures, are windows into what we value, into what matters to us, perhaps what's contentious in our societies, and what our moral expectations of others are. Through experiences of film and TV, they can also transport us to worlds that aren't our own, opening up experiences and emotions that we would perhaps ordinarily never be able to have. Famously, for example, we might watch horror movies in the safety of our home or theater as a way of experiencing fear without placing ourselves in actual danger. As the late US film critic Roger Ebert once said, however, films are also what he called, quote, empathy machines. And a natural sympathy toward a main character or protagonist can allow us to momentarily suspend our own prejudices and see things from another's point of view. So tonight I want to introduce a conversation that I hope will continue into the Q&A. I'll say a bit about moral injury in particular to ground us in an introduction, then present some of what I perceive to be helpful examples of moral injury, or at least those that approximate it on screen. So I'm going to do that in two categories. Those that show potentially morally injurious events themselves, sometimes we call those PMIEs, and those that deal primarily with the aftermath of moral injury, that might examine how we deal with it and its after effects. In the final section, I'll examine a few interesting reflections on how films shape and reinforce cultural values that I've gleaned through the use of film in a third-year undergraduate module I've taught this year here at Durham. So by means of introduction, at the risk of being pedantic, I want to ground this conversation with a quick review of moral injury and what we might note as its aftermath in different scenarios. And I know this might be old hat to many of us, but also gives me a moment to comment on the definition we've chose to feature on our website. So if you've seen it before, you'll note there we say that moral injury refers to the experience of sustained and enduring negative moral emotions, guilt, shame, contempt, and anger that result from the betrayal, violation, or suppression of deeply held or shared moral values. And I felt as we're offering a definition of MI, it was important to include the word suppression of values, as I think this is key and is not common in a lot of the discourse you'll find. It follows from my own work on moral injury and Augustine, and really includes the premise that our sense of good is malleable, but it's difficult to suppress our natural values. And many times they're often revealed, as my friend Michael Yandel might say, through their violation or through their absence. And so suppression seems like a valuable contribution to that larger overall discourse. This definition attempts to account for both the particularly injurious experiences themselves and certainly the aftermath of moral injury in defining it. And so it attempts to draw from both the two prevalent definitions from Jonathan Shea, who introduced the term, and from Brett Litz, who really built onto it in 2009. Shea famously, of course, says that moral injury is present when there's been a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. And the group of scholars led by Brett Litz in 2009 write that moral injury is perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about events that transgress deeply held moral values. And lately, as I've been going through and talking about moral injury in different ways, I realized there's a couple things that also were included in that Litz study that launches so much research, and these are often overlooked. But Litz makes a couple extra notes. He notes that warfighters bear witness to intense human suffering and cruelty, and that shakes their core beliefs about humanity. And finally, he notes, or what I want to lift up, I should say, they say plenty of things in this article, but he notes that the critical question to ask about moral injury is, what happens to service members who are unable to contextualize or justify their actions or the actions of others, and are unable to fully accommodate various morally challenging experiences into their knowledge about themselves and about the world? That's a way of framing things that allows us to also articulate the effects of moral injury. So across different contexts, from military to healthcare to veterinary practice to law enforcement and all the other ways we see that, we might be able to identify a few ways in which the aftermath is effective. First off, we can recognize it by a sense of broken social trust. This was a key point of Jonathan Shea. And he notes that there's a breach of the expectation that power will be used in moral ways. Shea particularly here says that there's a breach of an expectation that power will be used in accordance with what's right. Once that social trust is broken, he notes it's really damaging for us to find ways in which our agency makes sense in the world. And thus we can often come to experience an expectation of injustice, expectation of harm, or find ourselves constantly fighting off being exploited. This is often a feeling that military members who have suffered moral injury understand, as if their own agency has been co-opted uh, into the war effort, into the government, or just through the forces of war itself, such that they constantly, when they return home, fear that same kind of exploitation occurring in other contexts. One of the other things that we might see as a commonality across different contexts is there's a dehumanization or a violation of humanity at the heart of moral injury. That fundamentally what connects perhaps it in a military context with it in the NHS context from COVID is a sense that human dignity or human life itself has um, been impoverished, has been violated, and there's a sense of justice that it cries out for. Another aspect of moral injury that I just want to lift up that I think I'll point to because we'll see that as depicted in some of the films and shows we'll look at. There's a paper written in 2016 by an American scholar named Mary Catherine McDonald, and it was called Haunted by a Different Ghost. And she uses this term very carefully to describe the experience of moral injury. as being haunted by the experience and knowledge of an amoral world, or a world that just does not simply function by the same laws and moral codes that they're used to at home. In combat experience, this is often understood as kind of the anarchy of combat, that almost combatants enter a temporary situation where almost anything goes, and violence is kind of the thing that rules the day and almost the thing that restores social order more than adherence to moral values. What can become really haunting, and I really love the word that she uses here, it's very evocative, and I think is exactly that experience, that almost it's a knowledge that one almost wishes one couldn't have, a bell that one famously, as the saying goes, one wishes one could unring, and something one wishes one could unknow, but can't unknow. Whether that's the, can also be the kind of the things that human beings are capable of doing to each other, for example, a knowledge that's painful and haunting also is morally injurious. And I think that's particularly profound. So, with those kind of things in mind, with those kind of reference points for moral injury, I want to take a look at a few examples of that in film and TV. Let me make just a few brief caveats as I turn to that. So, this list and the things I'll point to doesn't include documentaries, which are, there's a great one we've just encountered called What I Want You to Know. It's a film made about moral injury, really is told from the perspective of US troops in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's an extremely powerful, very raw film. And these kinds of media, from that film, What I Want You to Know, and other documentaries, are absolutely necessary and fantastic in their own right. Those generally do have to be sought out. You have to have an understanding of moral injury that you go looking for to engage with those. What I want to talk about tonight is kind of ways in which our shared media, our shared popular culture might be used to identify and really begin conversations around moral injury. Secondly, there are certainly some spoilers for media I had mentioned. I've really tried to avoid them for newer shows and films. I apologize in advance, though, as some of them are unavoidable in making the points I want to make about the films and just highlighting different sections. Three, there's an excellent list of films that deal with moral injury on the Shea Moral Injury Center's website as well. I've also intentionally avoided duplicating discussion of any of those films. So please know that those are wonderful resources mentioned here. I think Jane can probably post a link there in the chat as to those resources. And so I'm going to talk about ones that also complement those, but don't intrude on that list. So there's a different set of resources that hopefully can be used in combination there. And it probably goes without saying, but most of these movies and films and shows are a difficult watch. Like most powerful narratives, they're also somewhat dangerous as they approach and hint at really uncomfortable truths. So please recognize this and give yourself grace. If you've experienced moral injury yourself, some of these also may prove to be distressing. I know for myself, as I was selecting films to watch for my third year module this year, I omitted a few, notably American Sniper, that I absolutely cannot watch for one scene in particular that's just way too close to my own experiences in Iraq. So please bear this in mind as we proceed as well. Okay, without further ado, let me turn to our conversation in earnest in some films that depict potentially morally injurious events. So again, these are first ones that depict those somewhat directly. So first on the list has to be, of course, the venerable Steven Spielberg 1995 film Saving Private Ryan. Obviously, there are multiple depictions in this film of what potentially morally injurious events can be. There's plenty on the initial beach in Normandy, from medics working to stabilize wounded soldiers whose bodies are then torn apart by subsequent attacks, rendering often their agency seemingly as meaningless amongst the force of war, to the extreme violence and the trauma of horrifically wounded soldiers calling for their own mothers on the beach, reverting to that plea for psychological comfort in states of just extreme physical and emotional agony. There's also, though, moments in that of American cruelty. For example, letting German soldiers burn to death in that initial segment instead of shooting them and putting them out of their misery briefly. When the Americans reach the top of the hill, and Tom Hanks's unit does that, there's a moment where they kill two surrendering German soldiers. In this case, they're actually Czech citizens, and they're trying to communicate in check that they were pressed into service by the occupying Germans, and they have not there by choice and wish to surrender. They're subsequently shot immediately and killed by the American troops. Post Normandy invasion, though, there's some really you really kind of get into the reflections on perhaps where social trust may be broken that you can, I think, see in this film. The mission that they embark on itself, that effort to actually take a unit, dispatch them, and cross often dangerous and enemy territory into combat, into violence itself, to save one person in the conflict. And these ethics are constantly questioned by Captain Miller, Tom Hanks's character, and several others in his unit. Some to humorous effect, even. Why does Ryan get to go home? How many do we sacrifice for him? The aspect of that mission itself implies kind of a dangerous aspect of social trust that's teetering on the brink. One thing that rarely gets talked about in the film, though, that really came out in our conversations in the course of this term was the experience of Corporal Upham, who's seen here on kind of just to the right of Tom Hanks. If you recall, at one point in the film, if you've seen it, he tries to save the life of a German soldier that they've captured. Most of the unit want to kill him, and there's a big conflict briefly that takes place as to what's going to happen. And the film lingers there in a moment where you're really not sure if Tom Hanks, to this point, kind of been portrayed as almost the ideal noble military officer, is going to allow this to happen. Hanks decides to eventually actually let the soldier go, promises, makes him promise after so many paces to return to or to surrender to a British unit. He doesn't. Later in the movie, he pops back up towards the end and actually delivers the shot with his German unit that he's reunited with that kills, shooting the shot that mortally wounds Captain Miller. It's a strange moment where Oppum then realizes who the soldier is, what the soldier's done, and just as he happily recognizes Oppum, Oppum shoots and kills him as he's surrendering. And there's this profound moment, I think, within that where we see Oppum's expectation, his moral expectation that if he did the right thing, that would somehow not come to result in this incident when he is forced to then confront and do something against his own morals, shoot the surrendering soldier that he was trying to save for out of that same moral principle. And there's a really interesting commentary, I think, on that, on the force of war and the way it corrupts and distorts our moral intention that's really valuable here. Finally, in terms of that understanding of social trust, this really came out to me when I was watching this movie in conversation with my really brilliant undergrads here. But this final line that a dying Captain Miller pulls Private Ryan in close and says, "Earn this," his dying breath. And it's perceived in as an extremely emotional moment. And I think I've taken that way most of the time I've seen the film. But what I was reminded at this moment and seeing this time, this is an exhaustive thing and a really incredible weight to put on someone. That if you consider this from Ryan's perspective, he has to spend the rest of his life attempting to live into those words, the words of the dying man who saved him, to implore him to do something meaningful. And so we can read that, you can see that differently and through the lens of moral injury, that as the older Ryan is sitting at Captain Miller's grave saying, "I've thought about those words you said to me on the bridge every day of my life," as both something that was motivating and in that same sense we were just mentioning, something haunting, something that constantly may force him to ask that question, have I done enough? Have I done this? Do I deserve this? And in that sense, almost what a profoundly morally injurious thing that is in terms of a weight to carry and a moral expectation to set for yourself. Let me get my controls back there. So a film that I perhaps resonate most deeply with, one of the first war films that I remember encountering that I think holds a really profound moment of moral injury, is Oliver Stone's 1986 film Platoon. It's, again, perhaps the go-to haunting example of a violation of Shay's conception of what's right by a person in a position of authority in a high-stakes situation. In this film, there's a moment, it depicts, of course, an American unit in Vietnam as they're going through and trying to root out Viet Cong from different villages in Vietnam. There's a moment where it's frustrating, where the characters can't, they find a lot of resources, a lot of rice, some weapons, and they know that somebody must be going through this village, but nobody will talk, nobody will admit to where their enemy might be or how they're interacting with them. And Tom Berenger's terrifying, his scarred and violent Sergeant Barnes, depicted here, leads the platoon in the raid of the village that culminates in him executing the wife of the village elder because he's just simply tired of listening to her complaint. He gets so angry and frustrated. But the killing of her in front of her husband and children is a horrific moment. And the discomfort and horror of that one moment is evident on the faces of everyone involved. The fractured platoon really then falls into factions, some supporting Barnes, and then some supporting essentially the resistance against him who find it morally offensive, led by William Defoe's Sergeant Elias. It devolves really into intra-platoon violence from this moment onward, with Barnes eventually shooting Elias, and Charlie Sheen's kind of almost audience and director himself, surrogate character Chris, eventually killing Barnes. And one could argue that this is a pivotal example of the breach of social trust. That expectation, not only that something, violation of what's rights occurred, but there's no expectation that there'll be accountability for this. And thus, this inter-squad conflict could be understood as a somewhat tragic, if very understandable, attempt to restore some sense of moral order. A film from the global war of terror era that I think really does a wonderful job of illustrating some examples of moral injury. Wonderful is a strange word to use there, but I think it depicts it really well. Is Catherine Bigelow's 2012 movie Zero Dark 30. From a filmmaking perspective, also, I would argue this is amongst the best films on an already great list of stellar movies. In my own view, again, it captures quite well that moral degradation of suppressed moral values, a distorted sense of virtue that culminates in what we might say as a sliding scale of moral permissiveness that characterized many elements of the global war on terror. It, of course, tracks the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and essentially, through the eyes of CIA analyst turned somewhat operative Maya, who's tasked with tracking bin Laden, it looks at the methods that the CIA and American military and political apparatus use to track him. It portrays many incidents of torture without, in my view, this is not an uncontroversial view, without taking a firm stance on it. It allows the viewer really to explore that idea of how did we get here? How did we get to this moral space? How does 9/11 and the attack on the United States culminate in this sliding scale of moral permissibility? And to me, it can't be viewed as anything triumphant, but more of a horrific idea of, again, we're haunted by the specter of either an amoral world or haunted by the specter of what the United States is called to do and imposes on its own military members to do after 9/11. It's almost being haunted by the specter of a moral world of our own making, amidst moral and political pressures we can't seem to find another way out of. And in that way, I think depicts moral injury in a really profound sense. Another film that I think does this really well, and a way to start this conversation, is 2019's film 1917, directed by British director Sam Mendes. It chronicles, of course, the exploits of a British infantry unit, two soldiers who are tasked with delivering orders that will save an entire division from a strategic German ambush. And again, apologies, there's a moment of spoiler here if you haven't seen 1917. But just for a moment, if you want to mute, portrays many aspects of moral injury. Perhaps the most pivotal, though, a moment when Private William Blake, depicted here in the foreground, pulls a downed German pilot from the wreckage of his burning aircraft, only for that rescued pilot to immediately pull a dagger from his uniform and fatally wound Blake with it. In a scene that is admittedly difficult to watch, Blake asks his friend Schofield, the two pivotal characters around which the movie really hinges, He asks Schofield, "Am I dying?" And Schofield has, after a moment of difficult decision, informs him that yes, he thinks he is. And Schofield really carries this moment of Blake's death with him from the rest of the film. And one can perhaps even debate how it colors his interactions with German soldiers later in the film, both in perhaps attempting to honor Blake's humanity and kindness towards his fellow soldiers caught up in the conflict, as well as a fevered determination to save his countrymen. It also features some spectacular portrayals of soldiers who've become so deeply disturbed by the moral implications of the conflict uh, that they have almost that famous thousand-yard stare in their eyes and exhibit it in different ways. Perhaps most notably, Andrew Scott's Lieutenant Leslie in the film, who's kind of lost a sense of time, yet seems extraordinarily competent and almost just really cavalier about these two soldiers having to go over the top of the into no man's land, kind of almost sarcastically blessing them with holy water as he goes over the top. And then this sense of kind of moral flattening him culminates with what seems to be a very serious admonition. He gives them a flare gun and then says, "We don't have a lot of these, though, and I'd really appreciate it if you're about to be killed by the Germans and come under heavy fire, if you just toss that back to us, in one of your dying moments. That'd be great." Again, I think just having that air of, I'm competent, I'm still functioning, but all kind of moral sense is just flattening. We've been unmoored from what moral principles are here, and I'm just going through the motions. And also, what really interesting about this movie, what hangs in the air for a long moment, is the final decision of Benedict Cumberbatch's Colonel Mackenzie. Forgive me, another spoiler here. Who, after reading the order that Schofield survived to bring him in harrowing circumstances through the whole movie, he seems to hesitate for so long that the audience begins to wonder if this movie is going to have a tragic end, in which he ultimately refuses to call off the attack and through sheer stubbornness allows his men to be killed. He does call it off, but we're left there to linger for a moment on the possibility that this has an incredibly tragic outcome. The idea that a heroic effort might prove futile, and that all agency against such force is pointless. Again, as we've talked about, a really key marker of moral injury. Dovetailing on that film is the latest, um, I should say, film incarnation of Henri Marquet's All Quiet on the Western Front novel, this one in 2022. If that tragic vision is avoided somewhat narrowly in 1917, then it's lived into fully by this film. It's important to note, and I'll talk more about this later, that it's directed by German Edward Berger, the first actual German director to make this German story. I'll talk about the large-scale implications of this a bit later, but the film is, and again, forgive the spoilers for an almost century-old tale at this point. I feel a little safer with this one. This movie and this story is a dead man's tale, not the triumphant story of some bit of hope salvaged amidst war. It does a remarkable job of operating both a macro and micro scale, particularly this 2022 version, as it includes the tensions of the armistice negotiations set against the experience of a young German named Paul Baumer, who is motivated by stirring speeches that echo nationalistic sentiments in his German gymnasium, then excitedly enlists with his friends, where he's given literally a dead man's uniform and then sent to the front towards the end of the First War. The large-scale effects of conflict and its extreme dehumanization are seen in the peace negotiations. Daniel Bruhl's Matthias Erzberger, he asks for the fighting to stop while the negotiations are ongoing, only to be refused by the French Marshal Foch, who is in no mood to entertain German pleas for humanity. And from a Western perspective, it's a very interesting inversion. It puts the French side, the good guys in this situation, as the ones refusing kind of a humanitarian ceasefire in this case. It's also does a wonderful job of making things understandable. You understand why they're not in that mood to entertain a lecture on kind of humanity from the Germans at that point in the war. Baumer's unit is thus, though, as a result of this decision, left to fight and lose members in the waning days and hours of the war because the ceasefire is refused by the French delegation. Baumer himself suffers an incredibly personal moment of moral injury. He finds himself trapped in a mortar crater with a French soldier. Baumer fatally stabs the soldier after a struggle, then weeps bitterly at the discovery of a photo of the Frenchman's family. Kind of profound moment of recognition of the humanity of the man he's just wounded. He attempts to comfort him, to bandage the wound in tears as he's suffering a profound moral crisis of regret, guilt, and revulsion, as psychiatrist Dave Grossman might say, at the wound that he's caused and the life that he's taken. The movie also features a spectacular betrayal of what's right in Shay's terms on a very large scale, with Baumer's commanding general ordering attack in literally the final minutes before the armistice, attempting, and consistent with moral injury, to avoid the shame and failure, a judgment of previous generations who were victorious in their military efforts, by reclaiming some land at the last moments and salvaging some sense of victory just before the 11th hour armistice and before fighting is stopped. Baumer is, of course, killed in these last moments in the final attack, literally in this version of the film, as the bells chime 11, announcing the end of the war, the beginning of the armistice. There's so many elements of that which jive with the aspects of moral injury we've talked about. I think it's a wonderful example of that. We'll talk a little bit more about the power of that film in a cultural context in a few moments. From a non-military context, we talk about moral injury in different avenues. It'd be wrong not to highlight this movie, 12 Years a Slave, British director Steve McQueen's portrayal of Solomon Northup's novel, which came out in 2013. I have to say again, in appreciation of the craft of film and being a film buff myself, this is one of the finest movies I've ever seen. It's a stunning portrayal of Solomon Northup given by Chiwetel Ejiofor, a free black musician living in New York in antebellum United States. He's kidnapped and forced into slavery in Louisiana for 12 years before he's rescued and reunited with his family. It does a spectacular job of portraying the personal degradation, the forced complicity with the enterprise of slavery itself, the disfigurement and impossible moral choices forced on slaves in the American South. And it's really interesting as a storytelling device because it provides a window into the experience through the particular situation of Northup. Perhaps it is that his free status originally makes it somewhat easier for white audiences in the US even to identify with his plight in a personal way and become deeply invested in that struggle. Not to say this should be necessary for empathy, but I think it is a powerful way into the narrative in that sense. Therefore, it makes his experiences of the horrors of slavery perhaps the audience's as well. It culminates in this moment of profound moral degradation, the experience of a profoundly broken, dehumanized world that's sunk into Northup. What, for my money, includes one of the most moving lines in cinema when he is finally reunited with his family, despite being cleaned up, nattily dressed in his finest, in the same kind of clothes he wore before his experience of slavery. He returns to his family and manages to speak only in a hoarse whisper. Please forgive my appearance. I've had a difficult time these past few years. And he seems to internalize the devastation and horror at thinking it's very apparent even in his own visage, as though to understand the moral disfigurement he's been through must shine through his face. Turning to a few examples from television, there's a comment in one of our ICMI chat groups that really started this off by highlighting the show on BBC that began last year, Blue Lights, and the way it portrays moral injury. It's something of a new high point in the proud tradition of the British cop drama genre. It's set in contemporary Belfast, many of the neighborhoods still simmering with tensions from the troubles and the conflict in Northern Ireland. Those tensions between loyalists, between Republicans, between the police attempting to keep some sense of order, and the profound histories of betrayal, violence that erupt from people that we think might be safe. There's so many switchings of sides and muddy alliances in this that by the end of this conflict, it creates such a ground of history untold, of stories yet to be revealed and understood. It produces so many situations of moral injury, it'd be impossible to describe them. I won't try. The frame here has captured perhaps the two most prominent characters, Constable Grace Ellis and Constable Stevie Neal, reacting to a situation in which a young boy who has been influenced by his loyalist uncle has just found a pistol and has fired around from his home into the back of their car and is now standing horrified by the street, but still holding the weapon, and them attempting to figure out what the right thing to do in this situation is. Again, it does a wonderful job of taking moments and showing the impact that those have as influenced by the long history of violence and long simmering cultural tensions and moral injuries. Another film in the same realm, HBO's Band of Brothers. It's almost a cheat to put this in the TV category, as its production values make it essentially a 10-hour Hollywood movie. But since it is technically television, I'll put it here. Explores moral injury in so many situations with a group of soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division, from the invasion of Normandy through to the end of the war in Europe in 1945. There's moments depicted. One of the ones of moral injury that I find fascinating is a very ambiguous and unclear moment in the narrative where an American officer perhaps executes several German prisoners. And that kind of ambiguity is explored to us through the stories of the men and kind of the ways they imagine that this happened or heard that this happened or is rumored that this happened. And the ambiguity of that moment and the moral kind of weight of it ripples through the consciousness of the other troops and their conscience as there's other moments where members encounter a concentration camp, have to deal with the immediate moral difficulties in processing it, of which there are many, and certainly many other morally injurious situations. But I want to draw attention to one aspect of the show, which is that each episode of the show begins with an interview of the actual soldier depicted by different actors in the film. So Shifty Powers, no relation, is the unit marksman of the show. And he notes in one of them, in kind of a blink and you'll miss it moment, something he's thought about, he says, all the time, is the idea that the Germans he fought could have, in other circumstances, been good friends of his. He imagines in great detail, maybe we would have hung out, maybe we would have had dinner at each other's houses, maybe we would have drank beer together. But that full affirmation of their humanity, that they might have been just like him, is clearly something that has haunted him for some time afterwards. Okay, so I put this on the list as an interesting way to grab a conversation that may be active in popular culture by referencing HBO's House of the Dragon. This is a popular show that's ongoing at the time. Um, it features tons of moments of moral injury. If you know anything about this universe, it's a really horrific and violent kind of fantasy medieval era. But it's premised around a particular moral injury that I think might resonate and have we might find other connections in our own world today. The fact that a woman in the direct line of succession to a dying king is passed over for a more distant male relative in the line of succession, and this reverberates down into an eventual civil war. But what's interesting about this is there are rare moments when stories are told that feature an intractable conflict that's portrayed as such precisely because one might understand the fears, desires, and actions of characters on each side of what will become a violent conflict. My experience as an American, for example, reading about the Troubles and the history of things in Northern Ireland is exactly that. It provides that aspect where you can see how this became an intractable conflict by understanding the motivations, not condoning, but understanding where different actions and motivations come from, understanding those fears. And the show, while set in a fantasy universe that we can take seriously or not, does a really good job, I think, of portraying sympathetic motives on both sides of a conflict and all the ways in which one or two events can harden a situation of tension into a conflict. And at its best, I think the concept of moral injury allows us to understand the humanity and motivations of actors on different sides of a situation, their embeddedness in their own pressures and tensions, and the ways in which our choices, devastating though they may be, are constricted. And this show does a good job of demonstrating exactly that aspect that characters, even the ones that we are inclined to think might be villains, actually are human beings as well and have reasons for doing what they're doing. And I think this helps us to construct both a sense of how moral injury functions, as well as a notion of common humanity that allows us perhaps to see past situations where we might want to describe a simple right and wrong. Okay, I'm going through these in a lot of detail. I'll try to be a bit briefer here on highlighting a few things that show the aftermath of moral injury really well. And I want to note my go-to situation, if I have to highlight one character in a war movie that really portrays moral injury well, it's a character on screen for only a few minutes, plays a relatively minor role in Mel Gibson's 2016 film Hacksaw Ridge. It's a story of Desmond Doss, whose Medal of Honor citation is amazing and goes, it's such a heroic tale that goes beyond the idea, even in the narrative presented in this film. It's not him that I want to focus on. His father, Tom Doss, a veteran of the First World War, who's in the story about his son's struggles to join the army to fight in the Second. He's portrayed brilliantly by Hugo Weaving because he's a complex character with many monstrous traits. When we first meet him, he's violent and abusive to his wife. He's a difficult and often absent father to his children. He drinks heavily and has great difficulty enduring the fact that he's the sole survivor of his group of friends that enlisted and went to France together in the First War. Yet with only a few minutes of screen time, Hugo Weaving somehow portrays him with a complexity and a humanity, allowing us to see a moral agony at his heart, and something perhaps even of a redeemable nature that refuses to allow us to simply call him a monster, even though he does horrific and monstrous things. He fights for his son's right to be a conscientious objector as a Seventh-day Adventist, and he really draws on his a few wells of moral fortitude that he has to do so. It's brilliant, I think, in portraying moral injury because it neither minimizes the pain he causes others, nor allows him to become a one-dimensional monster. It allows you to see both that this is a serious life-changing, character-changing event, as Shay says, through someone that can do terrible things, but still retain some sense of humanity. And hopefully that allows us to see, again, that aspect of moral injury at its best and understanding humanity itself. Another film, non-military context, would be Irish director John Michael McDonagh's 2014 movie Calvary. A spectacular film that at its heart is a story of clerical abuse uh, and its destructive after effects, both personally, for one victim in particular, and for a priest attempting to live the tenets of his faith with integrity in a world that's seemingly kind of moving on, in a sense. It has, for the record, also a fairly spectacular premise. Brendan Gleeson's father, James, hears a confession one Sunday morning, and the penitent tells him that he's going to kill him in 1 week's time. And he says, quote, "Not because you're a bad priest, because what good would killing a bad priest do, but because you're a good one." He's going to do this seemingly to atone for the sins of those within the church that had abused him and destroyed his life. It really does a spectacular job, both as a film and just in telling the tale of the collapse of societal and institutional trust, the struggles to make sense of things and find a moral footing against the threat of violence, and to somehow even envision justice and forgiveness in that environment. It's a wonderful film. I'd really commend that. Another, interestingly enough, I want to point to it again in the House of the Dragon mold, I suppose, of looking to more popular entertainment to find examples of this, is Ryan Coogler's 2018 Marvel Cinematic Universe film, Black Panther. It's really, for my money, the high watermark for the Marvel Cinematic Universe in terms of filmmaking. It certainly explores a conventional comic book tale, but in doing so, Ryan Coogler really takes into account the effects of colonialism and the difficulty of maintaining a deliberate moral orientation amidst the deforming and corrosive effects of oppression, degradation, and violence. Perhaps the most complex and in many ways sympathetic villain in any of these comic book films, Michael B. Jordan's Eric Killmonger, is raised in poverty and the racial tensions of Oakland. Is himself a dark, kind of funhouse mirrored version of his cousin T'Challa, whose relatively privileged upbringing is son of the king of Wakanda. Killmonger becomes an American military operative learning to kill, become an effective and ruthless killer. Tensions it explores in terms of what justice looks like for oppressed communities, in terms of fighting oppression in the ways of the oppressor, or forging another path through what asserts a different way of what's right. The film's resolution and the conflict between the characters really seems at the end of the day a tragic uh, knock-on effect of colonialism, oppression, that idea of what the deforming sense of oppression is on our expectation of injustice, and perhaps constricts our capacity to envision what justice might be. A couple others of note: Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan's 2023 film last year, of course, difficult to miss this film. While admitting it underscores the complex character of Robert Oppenheimer, proverbial warts and all, what stuck out to me in watching it's the somewhat genius narrative device the movie revolves around. Question of whether or not the scientists developed the atomic bomb and had indeed started a chain of events that would lead to the destruction of humanity. He really grapples with that idea of broken social trust. Oppenheimer himself, both in facing the difficult moral decision of whether bringing the weapon into existence in order to prevent the Nazis from potentially doing so was better than the alternative of hoping the world would never actually have to contend with it uh, in its own existence. Once developed, Oppenheimer has the hope that it will, as Shea says, I think, be used in accordance with what's right, and that his technology will. But he's forced to contend with a potential breach of social trust on two fronts, both with the US government's marginalization of him as a voice in future nuclear development, as well as the revocation of his security clearance in the post-war Red Scare. Both, I think, easily constituting for him was a breach of social trust and extreme moral pressures. Just briefly touching again on one that's perhaps salient at the moment, Steven Spielberg's 2005 film Munich. It's really one of those oft-forgotten aspects of Spielberg's memorable career, telling the story of the Israeli response to the killing of its athletes at the 1972 Munich Games by the Palestinian militant organization Black September. Eric Banya's agent is tasked with hunting down and killing those responsible for the attack, and it leads him to invent devious and creative ways of assassinating them. What the movie becomes is the portrait of a man and several men, slowly and sometimes rapidly losing their grip on a sense of meaning and right in the world through their own violent actions. Most memorably, perhaps, he plants a bomb on a television set to kill one of his targets. A later scene shows him in a panic almost in his own hotel room as he disassembles the TV set in there for fear of what he now knows might possibly lurk in it. The movie depicts that loss of safety, the inability to trust that danger is not lurking around every corner, and perhaps most powerfully, what it's like to be haunted by the knowledge of what we're capable of doing to each other. And that expectation of harm and violence. A few notes on TV shows that I think do a spectacular job of the aftermath of this. If we can forgive Jared Harris's portrayal of a Russian on its face, it's actually a wonderful portrayal of a Russian scientist that continuously has to contend with the government of the Soviet Union's difficulty in comprehending both the gravity of the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl and the implications and responsibility it has to be transparent for the sake of the European continent. Harris's Valery Legasov struggles with his own complicity in the aftermath, despite the fact that he agitates against his political handlers almost to the point of his own execution or exile. And that strong sense of his own complicity, despite him doing what he thinks is right, is really a key point here. He ultimately takes his own life as he attempts to get the truth out through a series of his own recordings. Again, I think a really strong portrayal of moral injury. All right, one I'll just touch on, again, for the no spoilers aspect of it, because it's relatively new, and it's almost something I'd want everybody to see on its own, which is the FX 10-part, I believe, limited series, what they would call it, Shogun. It just premiered this year. Massively improved over the 1980s version, if anybody has any memories of that, particularly in its focus, which is not on the Englishman John Blackthorne, whose ship crashes into Japanese shores in the early 17th century, but on the Japanese characters. That's the focus of the 2024 version, of their culture of honor and shame, and the ways in which their moral codes both produce agonizing and traumatic situations, as well as give their lives kind of a profound sense of meaning and purpose. So since it's new, I won't spoil it. It's safe to say that its central plot revolves around a profound sense of moral injury on the point of several key characters. And finally, in this realm, let me say I'll turn to my go-to example for what the aftermath of moral injury feels like. It's HBO/Sky Atlantic, if you're on this British side of the Atlantic, show The Leftovers. It ran from 3 seasons from 2014 to 2017. It has what seems like a ridiculous plot. Don't worry about the plot device. The plot device is that 2% of the world people vanish in a moment. No explanation. They're just gone. And as the showrunner says at the beginning of the first season, if you're looking for an explanation for that, this isn't the show. We're never going to give one. The point is what happens after. It's a fascinating exploration of what happens when science, governments can't give an answer for what happens. There's no sense of rhyme or reason. Religions don't seem to have any sense of what's going on, nor can they seemingly offer much comfort. It's a complete loss of trust, social meaning, and decay in society. Cults arise, there's conflict over memory and forgetting. It's kind of the sense of uneven trauma. Some people's whole family depart in that moment. They call it a departure. Other people lose one or two people that are connected to them tangentially. One town famously in Texas loses no one. But it has this remarkable sense of honest exploration of what do we turn to when we've lost all sense of grounding amidst what we understand as ambiguous loss. It's unequivocally my favorite show of all time, just to, not to put too much of a thumb on it. It's a hard watch. It's difficult to market, which is why it didn't succeed well, because in truth, it's an extended meditation on loss and grief over about 30 hours of television. And yep, it's a hard sell. I get that. But it's also a wonderful explanation of what I think moral injury feels like is this show. I've joked that as I was writing my dissertation, if I could score it to music, it would be to the theme of this show. It's that great. So um, let me just say, I know I'm starting to run long. Let me take 5 minutes to get to something really interesting to wrap us up, though, because I want to, if those are good examples of kind of film and TV portrayals of moral injury, I want to turn to reflect kind of at a second order on that just a bit. And that's kind of to pose this idea that is our film and cinema the new symposium, kind of in a Greek sense, that this is the place where we come and discuss ideas and values and take those apart. And I joke that it's the new slash already old one, because that's already being replaced by more short term and short form videos and social media like TikTok and those kind of places. But for now, perhaps we can pretend that that's still the heyday of those. I mentioned before, I taught a third year course in which we featured film in kind of moral injury, not just in terms of how it might introduce us to those experiences, but also how within our particular cultures it both shapes and reinforces our values and moral expectations, particularly regarding war, as the majority of the public will, of course, never experience this firsthand. So in this course, we explored this along the lines of two differing opinions on war films. The first from French director Francois Truffaut, who said, "There's no such thing as an anti-war film." Steven Spielberg was confronted with this quote, I believe, after making Saving Private Ryan, or perhaps it was Schindler's List. I can't remember which of the two. But he made the claim that every war movie, whether good or bad, is an anti-war movie. And so we really tried to get at through this lens, what does that mean? What are these films communicating to us? How do they both reflect values and shape the cultural expectations of the morality of conflict? An interesting way, just to dig at that question a bit further, it's complicated by the reception of films. Whatever the director might intend, or whatever the director's think he's made, the public reception of that may be entirely different. And our understanding of what the values are at the heart of it could be entirely, foreign to what the director intended. So a great example of this is Francis Ford Coppola, for example, who famously made Apocalypse Now in 1979. I think it's safe to say he made the film as kind of a commentary on the absurdity and madness of war. It's almost a mythological kind of retelling of that goes to ridiculous excesses to describe kind of war through the eyes of characters that are pretty exaggerated. Here, a couple of later reflect just a few years ago, in fact, that it was hard to say that he'd made an anti-war movie because it features things like stirring helicopter attacks on civilians. And he in Coppola's own words, that's certainly not anti-war. And indeed, it's an interesting example because this is validated in a looking glass kind of moment from the 2005 film Jarhead, which is adapted from a former U.S. Marine named Jake Swafford's memoir of his time in service. And in that film, Apocalypse Now is used in training to pump up Marines for the experience of killing. Specifically, the scene that Coppola had alluded to there of the helicopters flying with to the music Flight of the Valkyrie. In the film Jarhead, that moment becomes an almost sexual buildup of tension that can only be released by killing. And these Marines watching it in the theater in training kind of really exhibit that kind of sense of being worked up about killing itself as just an ultimate end. And so, as I talk about this and as I'm working through this, I want to kind of bring us to the idea that if we're attentive to moral injury and the ways in which TV and film and images of it both reflect and affirm our cultural values, then we should also pay attention to the effect within us when we watch these kind of movies, particularly war films. And I find this gets really interesting in intercultural dialogue, films made from other cultural perspectives, and with those in conversation with those from other cultures. So my undergrads uh, in my third year module were a great example of this and provided a rare glimpse in kind of a captive group in which we can have these conversations. And so to wit, this class was taught by me, an American who's lived in the UK for 6 years. And after a point in the course came when we watched three films. We watched Saving Private Ryan, we watched 1917, and we watched All Quiet on the Western Front. And I asked the class, which is predominantly, of course, a British audience with one student who has a deep German heritage. I simply said, which of the films did you feel most personally invested in? And I said, prefacing that, my vote is every day of the week, Saving Private Ryan. I feel like Steven Spielberg makes it from an explicitly personal and quite close emotional nature. Or emotional perspective. And so to me, it almost seemed an unfair question because 1917 is a different film shot at a good bit more resolve. All Quiet on the Western Front, even more so. Nope. Every single student that was British said, no, I connect much more with 1917 easily. Except for my one student who is British but had deep German heritage said, no, I thought by far, far and away, All Quiet on the Western Front is the one I connect most with. And so I explored this later and kind of said, hey, just out of curiosity, because all I have to go by is my own, we're kind of in the realm of really affective experience in this point. And I said, can I talk for just a moment about the scene in Saving Private Ryan then? Because there's a moment, and Saving Private Ryan itself, it has swelling, almost hymn-like music that kind of convey this sense of nobility to the Enterprise, that almost convey the nobility of sacrifice in the death of all the men at Normandy. Culminates in them recognizing that Private Ryan has lost I would say it, one of four children. The other three brothers are all killed, and their mother's about to receive all three telegrams notifying her of the deaths of three of her four sons on the same day. This is such a dire situation in the War Office that they bring it to General George Marshall. And Marshall in the film begins to read them a letter. The colonels are disagreeing about what to do about this. Some of them want to send in a group to try to rescue him, others don't, and say that's a waste. He reads a letter that begins to a Mrs. Bixby and says, and as he goes through the letter, he says, it reads, I understand that you're the mother of 5 boys who've given their lives in the cause of freedom. And it goes on to have some really emotional themes. It swells. It's brilliant. I'm already emotionally invested in it from the beginning. And then at the end of the letter, General Marshall here says, sincerely yours, Abraham Lincoln. As an American, I noted the moment he invokes Abraham Lincoln is just emotional hammer to be that invested in popular culture, and to evoke that name in that situation at the end of this already emotional moment is just really tough to take. I had to watch the film a couple times just to wash that from my experience before I watched it with the students. Um, and they were like, like, no, it's all right. Like, yeah, I mean, I understand why it's meaningful for you, but no, it just doesn't hit. And I thought, wow, there is so much in this that depends. These films are seeking to kind of stir something within us, and they draw within our cultural, they draw upon, I should say, our cultural memories and a kind of cultural vernacular and capital of all those things, such that, like I said, I hadn't realized, I had never read and understood, despite years of, quote unquote objectivity as a person looking at moral injury from the outside, studying it, understanding it, trying to understand my own biases and all of these things. I'd never thought about that final line from Private Miller or Captain Miller to Private Ryan, earn this, as really what what I would call, forgive my French here, a real dick move, to put that on him, until I saw it through this lens of, wow, if I detach myself from what I feel there, yeah, that's rough. That's a rough thing to put on somebody. You can recognize certain aspects of it. So it became a real interesting conversation about how both Saving Private Ryan in 1917 end with kind of this pivotal moment that something salvaged from this, right? The mission of Saving Private Ryan serves as a profound metaphor, for what U.S. and Allied troops have done in World War II, which is essentially save the nation, save the world entire. And Ryan becomes just simply a metaphor for that. And perhaps what it suggests they ask the rest of us is simply to do something worthy of that, to make that sacrifice worthy, to draw some good out of it. 1917 has a similar theme. It ends in that aspect of swelling, kind of, in the midst of war, we salvage some sense of goods. We are able to save some things, live according to our own values. And it was really interesting. This led to a conversation about 19 or All Quiet on the Western Front. I want to close with kind of this notion on the. I'm a big physical media geek, so I have the disc, this movie on disc, and the insert with this comes with an interview printed with Edward Berger, and he talks about the experience of making this particular story, All Quiet on the Western Front, from a German perspective. It'd been done by American directors before, but never by a German director. And he says, uh, in most cases, American or British war movies cannot help but find a positive side to their stories. For example, whenever I'm traveling on the tube in London in November, I see people wearing poppies in remembrance of the ceasefire. The soldiers returned home after the war and were celebrated as heroes in Trafalgar Square. We're familiar with similar images from the United States in Times Square where people were embracing and falling into each other's arms. The United States was dragged into the war against its will, freeing Europe from fascism. That does something to a country's psyche. War is automatically associated with heroism. Heroism. Of course, it was also horrifying and resulted in terrible losses for these countries. But it was an experience with a successful outcome, and these days, when an American or British director portrays war in a movie, this ultimately optimistic feeling sort of permeates the storyline on its own accord. Contrary to this, it was important to make this movie from a German perspective. It's a perspective that no longer exists in modern war movies because we usually lack the courage and opportunities to show it. As Germans, our view of war is marked by grief and shame, sorrow and death, destruction of guilt. There's nothing positive or heroic. Every death, regardless of which side, is a death and is therefore simply horrific. It's a person who died. Making our German history, background, and attitude towards war the driving force behind the movie was a huge and fascinating challenge. And I thought it might be interesting to share this perspective from Germany with the world. And I think that's a fascinating and really self-aware commentary on his own film that illustrates that perspective so much, that so much of this is tied to our own culture and how we process it. And so much of these war movies reflect, whether we realize it or not, our own cultural kind of touch points, our own emotional capacities, stories we tell and have always told, and weaves parts of those stories in its own narrative to connect with us. So I mentioned that as I close, kind of an opening conversation, I should say, on TV and moral injury, just to say, however we interact with this kind of media, it's perhaps best engaged as a way of opening conversation, of talking about moral injury. In this capacity, I want to note that I do think film and TV here have a particular and distinct power. But I think, as Berger kind of brings out there at the end, we should engage them reflectively, aware of what we're drawn to, of what they say about us, the expectations we hold, and perhaps how these will contribute to moral injury as well.